sicker and sicker, and we did not know what was going on exactly. We took her to the emergency room yesterday afternoon, and they discovered that she had a UTI, and her blood pressures were almost to 500, her blood sugars were almost to 500. And that was probably because of the infection, not because she had been eating anything, because she had not eaten for quite some time. But they got her started on treatments for that, and we believe that those are going to help considerably. Tuesday she will go down to Gainesville for her biopsies, and then hopefully come back to the house, and that gives me tomorrow to work on hospice care and get someone programmed to come into the house and give us a hand. So that is an update on her condition. She deeply appreciates all of the prayers that all of you have lifted up for her, and I've kept her informed about all of those. Our children, happily, were Timothy and his family, two grandchildren going to college, one in Pennsylvania and one in Boston, came for Thanksgiving Day and stayed over till Friday morning. And then Andy Witt, our son-in-law, we still consider him a son-in-law because of his marriage to Sherry. He and his new wife Ginger brought the 3 grandchildren, and they came up Friday afternoon. Unfortunately, by that time she was starting to get really out of it, and so she could not enjoy their visit as much as she would have liked, but she was able to enjoy it, I think, a lot, just seeing the grandchildren again. Again, our whole family appreciates all of you. We love you, and we are just so, we do consider you our spiritual family. And so we wanted all of you to know that. And where's Mike? Well, Mike is going to make an announcement a little bit later at the end of the service about a little idea that he had, and I think that will be a good thing for us. Any questions about her condition or our condition? We've got everything, I think, under control. We're trying to keep the bills paid and the dishes washed and the clothes washed and the house picked up and things like that. Because as you probably know, at least I hope you can figure out, to me there's nothing worse than being sick in a dirty house. Because you just want to get up and do something about it, I guess. But I've always thought that, and so I've always made an attempt to keep, when I know we have some person sick, to keep the house in a way that would help to facilitate their healing. You know, I can't imagine a group of people like the Israelites in the 8th century who would do something like make a covenant with death. What do you think a covenant with death would even mean? Well, for them it meant that they believed that they could make a covenant with death so that death would just simply pass over the land and would not affect them. And the death, of course, that they were concerned about was the great Assyrian army of the 8th century, who was sweeping all across the Middle East, in many respects like ISIS today, sweeping all across the Middle East, and they were one of the most vicious armies in history. And so they thought that they could just simply make a covenant with death and with Sheol, or Hades, which I think is the Greek name for Sheol, the place of the dead, that they would not end up there as a result of this great military invasion. Now that was in spite of the fact that God said that He was allowing all of this, and one of the reasons that He would allow Israel to fall before these invaders was because of their unrighteousness and their love of foreign gods and their worship of foreign gods and all the things that had gone on in the 8th century at that time, the divided nation of Israel and Judah, but they considered themselves one people. And so they made this covenant with death and with Sheol, and of course we know that it did not work. All of the 10 northern tribes were carried away into obscurity. We have no idea what happened to those tribes. Judah and Benjamin managed to survive. And in the 6th century, they were invaded by Babylon, who at that time had become the big dog on the block. And so they were invaded by Babylon and were carried away into exile for 70 years before they were allowed to return home. It was out of those 2 tribes that ultimately Christ was born. It had to be that someone would be left out of which the divine Son of God could be born. Because God had promised that Son literally since the beginning of time. And we find promises even in the book of Genesis, as well as all the prophets, and the whole concept of the law as a bridge between human sinfulness and the grace of God. So there had to be someone left, and it turned out to be just those 2 small tribes of Benjamin and Judah. And Jesus was born from that small kingdom that by the time he was born was really under the dominance of Rome. They had been under the dominance of Greece for several hundred years, and then under the dominance of Rome. And yet they continued their worship primarily in Jerusalem and in the temple, and finally in the great temple of Herod. And it was in that time that Christ was born. And the Advent message for us is this. Advent, as you know, is the first season of the church year. Today we could say happy anniversary, happy New Year to one another, because for the Christian church, the first Sunday in Advent, or Advent Sunday, has always been the first day of the Christian year. And so everything from here is building toward the coming of Christ that we celebrate on the 25th of December, and then finally the life and the ministry of Christ that we get through, that we get to in the time of Epiphany, and then Lent, and all of the events associated with Lent, and then Easter. But his coming, Christ's coming, as the divine Son of God, and this is what we must understand. The divine Son of God, who is called in Scripture the Word of God, came into the world in complete humility. Now, if we can just get our minds around that, I think it would be wonderful for us to understand that the second person of the Holy Trinity was born as a tiny infant in the city of Bethlehem. So the first coming of Christ is a coming in complete humility. The second coming of Christ, which is the other part of the Advent season of the church year, which we also celebrate, the second coming of Christ, when it occurs, will be so spectacular that it will make the fireworks display at Disney World just seem like it's almost non-existent. You know, every night down at Disney World, they just blow off thousands and thousands of fireworks and the skies light up and everything like that. But that just happens in a small little tiny part of Disney World outside of Orlando. But imagine that the second coming will be something that the entire world cannot deny when it occurs. And so Advent then is a season in which we go back and we look at all the prophecies of the first coming, and we celebrate those, but we also look at what St. Paul talked about in the passage that you read from Romans, in which this great thing occurs, and the time, Paul says, the time is getting closer for that. We have no idea when that time will come. We don't know if it will be another 100 years, or another 1,000 years, or another 10,000 years, or what. We just simply don't know. All of that is in God's hands. All we can do is, and this is what Paul is stressing to the people, and the Christians in Rome, is we must be faithful. We must witness towards that which is coming with the good conduct of our lives today. And only that will help to prepare us spiritually for that second coming. But meanwhile, we do have the first coming that we will celebrate on the 25th of December, in which God will lay a stone, a cornerstone. I think that's the term, right? A cornerstone. And what does a cornerstone do? Now, you're a builder, Dave. Why would you have a cornerstone? What does it do?
It's where you build everything from.
Yeah, it basically, you start there with that, and then you build the walls out from the cornerstone. So, in essence, a cornerstone unites two walls. And what is united in the Christ and in the Christ child who was to be born, and in the Christ who lived and died and was resurrected and was ascended back to heaven, is that he was that cornerstone who joins heaven and earth, who joins man to God. And without that cornerstone, none of that can happen. It is only because of the work of Christ that we can have the hope that we talk about in the creeds, when we say the creeds, that we believe in the resurrection of the dead and life everlasting. And that is all because of Christ. And so for the next several weeks, we're going to be thinking and talking about that expectation of waiting for Christ, but then also that secondary expectation of Christ's second coming. So we will be dealing with all of those for the next several weeks. It's only because of that any of us have any hope. Otherwise, we might as well all make a covenant with death. You know, you're just going to occur, and there are plenty of people these days that do that. You're just going to occur. So I'm not going to worry about you one day, or worry about it from one day to the next, and I'm not going to let it affect the way I live my life. But if we believe as Christians that that time will come when Christ comes again, will carry us all home to glory, to be with him and with the Father, and to stand under the judgment of the Father, then we need to be very careful about, and as St. Paul said in his letter to the Romans, we need to be careful about how we live today. We can be like the foolish virgins that Jesus talked about, who did not have any oil for their lamps, And then the bridegroom came, and all they could do was scurry around and say, help me, give me some oil, to the 5 wise virgins who carried their oil with them. So we have to be careful today about how we live. And I know that I'm preaching to the choir here, because I know that all of you truly believe that, and that you live wonderful lives. But one of the greatest things that we can give the community that we live in today is a picture of what a life of expectation of the second coming of Christ looks like. I am going to celebrate communion briefly at the end of the service today, even though it is a morning prayer service. We will use consecrated elements. It's called a pre-sanctified liturgy, and we will use that at the end of the service. And I'm doing that simply because today is Advent Sunday, and I think that we should receive communion on the first Sunday of the church year. And so in just a few moments we will begin that. And I will invite all of you to come forward or to participate first in the liturgy, and then to come forward and receive communion that has already been blessed and sanctified and consecrated. And so we will just be receiving that. So let us at this time go ahead and take up our offering. And